Stabsarst Heinrich Faber wrote a letter to his wife on the evening of January 22nd, 1945, that he asked her, in the letter's final line, to keep rather than destroy, because I believe I will want to remember, someday, exactly what I was thinking tonight. He had spent the preceding 6 hours treating 11 wounded American soldiers, captured that afternoon during a German counterattack. Using supplies his own battalion could barely spare for its own casualties. His commanding officer had not ordered this. Nothing in his training or his orders required it beyond the minimum the Geneva Convention obligated him to provide. He had, by his own account, made a personal decision to treat the Americans with precisely the same care, the same order of priority based on medical urgency rather than nationality, that he would have given his own men. I have been asked, more than once tonight, why I am spending morphine on enemy soldiers that our own wounded may need tomorrow, he wrote. I have given a different answer each time, because I am still working out, even as I write this, which answer is actually true. I believe I owe you, and eventually myself, an honest attempt at that answer, rather than the convenient one I have been offering to men who simply wanted me to stop treating the prisoners and get back to work. Faber was, by January of 1945, a battalion surgeon with nearly 3 years of continuous field experience, most of it on the Eastern Front before his transfer west in the autumn of 1944. He had treated, by his own rough estimate recorded in a later letter, well over 2,000 wounded men across those 3 years German soldiers overwhelmingly, but also, on the occasions circumstance required it, Soviet and now American casualties who fell into German custody, wounded rather than dead. He had developed, across those years, what he considered a professionally necessary emotional discipline regarding the nationality of the men beneath his hands. A wound was a wound. A hemorrhage did not care which uniform surrounded it. He had trained himself, deliberately and with some difficulty in the war's early years, to treat the medical problem in front of him without permitting the broader war to influence his clinical judgment, on the theory that a surgeon who allowed hatred or tribal loyalty to affect his treatment decisions had, in some fundamental sense, stopped being a doctor and become something else entirely, an instrument of the war rather than a check against its worst excesses. This was, he would have said before January of 1945, simply professional duty, not a matter of any particular personal feeling toward the men he treated regardless of their uniform. What made the events of that January different, and what would eventually compel him to write the letter that opened this story, was not a change in this professional discipline. It was something that had happened 3 months earlier, in October, that he had carried with him, unresolved, through the following months of continuous retreat and increasingly desperate fighting, until the afternoon in January when circumstance finally gave him an opportunity to act on what he had witnessed. Faber had, in fact, written to his wife on several occasions in the 2 years prior to October of 1944 about the specific psychological burden of maintaining professional neutrality toward enemy wounded in a war whose broader character made such neutrality increasingly difficult to sustain emotionally, whatever its professional necessity. It grows harder, not easier, with time, he wrote in a letter dated the previous spring, to hold the line between the doctor's obligation and the soldier's grief. I have buried men I treated with my own hands, and I have watched other men, treated by that same pair of hands, return to try to kill the very soldiers I serve beside. I do not know a name for the particular fatigue this produces in a man over years, but I have come to recognize it in myself, and I suspect I am not alone among physicians in this war in carrying it. It was against this backdrop of accumulated, unresolved professional weariness that the October rescue would arrive, not as an isolated curiosity, but as something that seemed, to Faber at least, to answer a question he had been carrying, half-formed, for a considerable time already. The event that shaped Faber's decision occurred during an engagement in October of 1944, when his battalion's position was overrun in a sector held, on the American side, by a company from the 214th Infantry Regiment, the same regiment, coincidentally, that would produce the wounded prisoners he treated in January, though Faber himself would not learn this connection until considerably later. During the October engagement, a German medical evacuation point, clearly marked and located, by any reasonable interpretation of the laws of war, in a position that should have afforded it some measure of protection, came under fire during the confused fighting that followed an American counterattack against positions the Germans had briefly seized. Several German wounded, unable to move themselves, were left exposed in the open ground between the two sides' positions as the fighting shifted. What happened next was recorded, from the American side, in an account given by Corporal Nathaniel Doyle, a medic with the American company, in a post-war interview conducted decades later for a regimental history project. Saw some German wounded caught out in the open, position had changed hands twice in about an hour, and nobody'd had time to sort out who was where. Wasn't really a decision, the way I remember it. Just went out and got them, same as I'd have gone out for our own boys caught in that spot. Man's bleeding out in the open, don't much matter what uniform he's wearing, not in the moment you're actually looking at him. Doyle and two other medics from his company moved out under an informal, unspoken pause in the fighting, not a declared truce, but the kind of mutual restraint that sometimes emerged in close combat when both sides recognized what was happening and recovered 4 German wounded, bringing them back to American lines for treatment alongside their own casualties. Faber, observing this from a forward position through field glasses, recorded the moment in a letter written that same evening, months before the January engagement that would prompt his own decision. I watched 3 American medics cross open ground, under conditions that offered them no guarantee of safety, and no orders I am aware of requiring this specific action, to recover German wounded who would otherwise certainly have died from exposure and blood loss before nightfall. I do not know these men's names. I do not know if this represents the policy of their unit or simply the personal decision of 3 individuals in a single moment. I know only that I watched it happen, that it altered something in how I understood the men on the other side of this war, and that I do not yet know what I will do with that alteration, though I suspect I will eventually be required to do something with it. The October rescue, described above, represented the first and formative event in the sequence that would culminate in Faber's January decision. The 4 German wounded recovered by Doyle's medical team survived, according to Faber's own later correspondence with the battalion's medical records officer, and 2 eventually returned to active service after recovery. Faber attempted, in the weeks following the October engagement, to learn more about the American medics responsible for the rescue, through what limited channels a battalion surgeon in a rapidly shifting combat situation actually had available. He was largely unsuccessful, learning only through a captured American soldier interrogated some weeks later on an unrelated matter that the medics belonged to a company within the 214th Infantry Regiment, a detail Faber recorded in his correspondence without, at the time, any particular expectation that it would prove relevant to anything beyond his own private reflection on the incident. Through November, as his battalion continued its fighting retreat, and Faber's medical responsibilities grew increasingly overwhelming with the campaign's mounting casualties, he returned repeatedly, in his private correspondence, to the October rescue, working through what he clearly experienced as a genuine professional and moral puzzle rather than a simple sentimental attachment to a single incident. I have treated enemy wounded before, when circumstance required it, and I have done so, I believe, with proper professional care regardless of the discomfort this sometimes caused among my own men. He wrote to his wife in a letter dated November 8th. But I confess that what I witnessed in October has stayed with me in a way that my own prior conduct, however professionally correct, did not fully anticipate. I gave adequate care to enemy wounded because it was my duty. I am increasingly uncertain that duty alone explains what I observed those 3 Americans doing, since duty, strictly interpreted, would not have required them to take the specific risk they took for men who were not, in any sense that duty typically recognizes, theirs to save. A limited opportunity to act on this reflection arose in December, when Faber's battalion took a small number of American prisoners during a brief local action, 2 of them wounded seriously enough to require immediate surgical attention. Faber treated both, according to his own account, with what he described as heightened personal attention, beyond what strict duty required remaining with the more seriously wounded man through a difficult surgical procedure, well beyond the point where a battalion surgeon operating under pressure, and with numerous other casualties waiting, might reasonably have handed the case to a subordinate. I do not believe I treated these two men differently from how I would have treated any wounded prisoner before October. Faber wrote afterward, with the careful, self-scrutinizing honesty that characterizes most of his surviving correspondence. But I am aware that I thought about them differently while treating them, and I am not yet certain this distinction matters practically, even as I suspect it matters to me personally in some way I have not fully articulated even to myself. The engagement that produced the letter opening this story occurred on January 22nd, 1945, during a German counterattack that briefly overran a position held by a company from, as Faber would soon discover, the same 214th Infantry Regiment whose medics had conducted the October rescue. 11 American soldiers were captured, 7 of them wounded, several seriously. Faber's battalion, itself stretched thin by weeks of continuous fighting and possessing barely adequate medical supplies for its own casualties, faced an immediate and genuinely difficult resource allocation question that Faber's commanding officer, according to an account given by a surviving battalion staff officer, expected Faber to resolve according to standard triage principles that would likely have deprioritized enemy wounded relative to German casualties of comparable severity. Faber did not do this. According to the same staff officer's account, Faber treated all 18 wounded men, 11 German, 7 American, strictly according to medical urgency, without regard to nationality, personally overseeing the most critical cases regardless of which uniform the patient wore, and continuing to work through the night until every case had received what he considered adequate care. When challenged by a fellow officer, according to this account, about the wisdom of expending scarce morphine and surgical supplies on enemy wounded who might, once recovered, simply return to fighting against German forces in the future, Faber offered a response that the officer later recorded in his own private correspondence, apparently struck enough by it to preserve the exact wording. I told him that I had watched 3 American medics cross open ground under fire in October to save German lives that owed them nothing, and that I did not believe I could call myself a doctor of any real character if I discovered, 3 months later, that I lacked the willingness to extend the same conduct to their own wounded when the circumstance finally presented itself to me directly. He did not have a response to this that he considered adequate by his own account, and the matter was not raised again that night. Among the American wounded that Faber treated that night was, by a coincidence he would not discover for several more weeks, Corporal Nathaniel Doyle himself, the same medic whose October rescue had originally prompted Faber's extended reflection, wounded during the January engagement and captured alongside the rest of his company's survivors. Corporal Nathaniel Doyle, whose October rescue of German wounded had, unknown to him at the time, set in motion the chain of reflection that would eventually shape Faber's treatment of Doyle's own company 3 months later, gave his account of eventually learning this connection in the same post-war interview quoted earlier in this story. Didn't know any of this until years afterward, when a historian doing research on the regiment tracked me down and told me the whole thing. Doyle said, "Strange feeling, finding out something you did without much thought at all one afternoon in October maybe ended up mattering to my own care 3 months later when I was the one lying wounded and captured. Don't know that I believe in fate exactly or anything so tidy as that. But I've thought about it plenty since, how a decision you make in one moment, not even really thinking of it as a decision, can travel forward through a war in ways you never see happening and never get to watch unfold." Private First Class Elwood Hastings, another wounded American treated by Faber that January night, offered a more immediate account of the experience itself, given to a war correspondent shortly after his eventual repatriation. "Didn't expect much, being captured wounded, if I'm honest. Heard plenty of stories, some good, some considerably worse, about what happens to a man in that position. What I got instead was a German doctor who worked on me like I was any other patient he had reason to care about saving, no different in his manner than any doctor I'd have wanted treating me back home. Didn't understand it at the time. Understand it a little better now, having heard the fuller story since. Feldwebel Otto Riemann, a German medical orderly who assisted Faber through the long night of January 22nd, gave his own account decades later for a regional oral history project examining wartime medical service. The doctor didn't say much about why he was doing it that way, not that night. Just worked, hour after hour, same care for every man regardless of which side he'd been fighting on that morning. Some of us found it strange, given how short we were on supplies for our own wounded. Understood it better once the fuller story came out, years later, about what he'd seen back in October. Man doesn't forget a thing like that easily, I suppose, watching an enemy risk himself for your own wounded. Changes how you see the whole business, even if it takes a while to work its way through to how you actually act. The assessment that most directly addressed the broader significance of Faber's decision came from Generalmajor Kurt Albrecht, the divisional commander whose medical services Faber's battalion fell under, who included an extended discussion of the incident in a post-war reflection on the medical conduct of German forces during the war's final year. I became aware of Stabsarst Faber's conduct on the night of January 22nd, 1945, through the report of a subordinate officer who considered it, at the time, a matter requiring my attention as a potential breach of proper resource allocation during a period of severe supply constraint. Albrecht wrote in a memoir compiled decades later. I reviewed the matter and declined to take any disciplinary action for reasons that I believe are worth recording honestly, even at this distance from the events themselves. He continues, Faber's decision to treat American wounded according to strict medical urgency rather than nationality was, in the narrowest sense, a deviation from what a more rigid interpretation of resource allocation during that period of the war might have required. I do not believe, upon full reflection, that it was a deviation from what our own stated medical ethics actually demanded of us. However imperfectly those ethics were observed elsewhere in a war that produced no shortage of conduct that failed to live up to them. Faber had witnessed, some months earlier, an act of mercy from the other side that cost the men performing it nothing they were obligated to give. He responded, when circumstance allowed, in kind. I do not believe this represents naivety about the broader character of the war we were fighting. I believe it represents one officer's determination that some minimal thread of shared human obligation should survive that war, regardless of how much else did not. Albrecht closes his reflection with an observation that a post-war military ethics scholar reviewing the document would later cite specifically. I have thought a great deal, in the years since, about how few documented instances of this kind of reciprocal mercy survive from that period of the war, when circumstances on every side had grown increasingly desperate and increasingly brutal. I do not believe Faber's conduct was representative of the war as a whole, and I would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. I believe, rather, that it represents an important exception evidence that even amid everything else that occurred, some individuals on both sides retained the capacity to recognize an obligation to the wounded that transcended the uniform those wounded happened to be wearing, and that this capacity, rare as it may have been, is worth recording honestly precisely because it was rare, rather than pretending it was either universal or non-existent. Heinrich Faber survived the war, was held briefly as a prisoner following Germany's surrender, and returned to civilian medical practice in a small Bavarian town, where he continued working as a physician for nearly 4 decades afterward. He rarely discussed his wartime service publicly, according to family members interviewed for a post-war medical history project, with one significant exception. The January 1945 letter to his wife, preserved among his personal papers and eventually shared, with his family's permission, as part of a broader historical study of medical conduct during the war's final year. Nathaniel Doyle and Heinrich Faber never met again after the war, though Doyle, upon learning the full story decades later, wrote a letter to Faber's family expressing what he described, in his own words, as a debt I never knew I owed and never got the chance to properly repay, though I suppose the repaying happened already, in its own roundabout way, 3 months before I even knew there was anything to repay. Faber's daughter, who received the letter, replied on her father's behalf, Faber himself, having died some years earlier, with an account of the passage from his own war diary that had first prompted his reflection on the October rescue, so that Doyle might finally see, in Faber's own words, exactly what his own unremembered act of mercy had eventually produced. Doyle, asked near the end of his own life what he had come to understand about the exchange across the years, gave an answer that closes the story about as completely as any account could. Took me a long while to really understand it, if I'm honest. Wasn't thinking about consequences. That October afternoon, wasn't thinking about anything much beyond 4 wounded men bleeding out in a spot somebody needed to reach before dark. Didn't know, couldn't have known, that a doctor on the other side was watching, or that it would matter to him the way it apparently did, or that it would come back around to my own care 3 months later in a way neither of us could have predicted. Makes me think now that you never really know which small decision is going to turn out to be the important one. Best you can do is just try to make the right call in the moment you're actually standing in, and trust that it matters somehow, even if you never get to see how. Heinrich Faber's letter to his wife, the one that opened this account, ends with a line that his daughter chose to include when she eventually shared the full document publicly, decades after both the letter and the war itself had passed into history. I do not know if what I did tonight was correct by every standard a stricter officer might apply. I know only that I watched 3 men, whose names I never learned, choose mercy over safety on an October afternoon that owed me nothing, and that I have spent every day since trying to become the kind of doctor and the kind of man capable of answering that mercy in kind whenever the war finally gave me the chance to do so directly. Tonight it did. I hope I answered it honestly. That is the whole of the story. That is all it ever was. There is a final detail, recorded almost as an afterthought in the historian's own notes from the project that eventually reunited these 2 threads of the story, that seems worth including here. When Doyle received Faber's daughter's reply, along with the passage from her father's war diary, he reportedly read it through twice before setting it down, and then asked the historian, who happened to be present for the exchange, a single question that the historian recorded verbatim because it struck her, in the moment, as the truest possible response to everything she had just described to him. He asked simply, did he ever find out I made it home? The historian, who had by that point in her research confirmed exactly this detail, was able to tell him yes, that Faber had in fact learned some years after the war, through channels neither man could now fully reconstruct, that the American medic from the October rescue had survived his own wartime wounds, and had noted this fact, briefly and without elaboration, in the final pages of his own private diary, closing a circle that had taken the better part of 4 decades to complete, and that neither man, in the end, would ever have known was closed at all, had someone not eventually thought to ask.